Hey, so I want to talk about the subject of presidential assassinations. Now, this is obviously quite a dark subject, but it is also undeniably an interesting subject. I'm particularly focusing, I should say, here on American history and US presidents. Obviously, there's been other world leaders throughout the ages who've been assassinated, but I'm particularly focusing on American presidents, partly because I know more about those cases and also because just for the sake of condensing it. Um, so, four American presidents have had their lives taken by assassins: Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. Um, and of those two, almost certainly JFK and Lincoln are by far the most documented. I think there's a variety of reasons why the other two deaths are not quite as prominent in the public mind. And there's different ways to look at it. Firstly, Lincoln's death came amidst a number of circumstances. He was the first president to be assassinated, so that was obviously a first. There had been actually previous attempts. I believe there were attempts on Andrew Jackson and others. So I find it hard to believe that it would have been absolutely inconceivable in the public mind that a president's life could have been taken. In fact, early in his term, there was another attempt against Abraham Lincoln. Remember that whilst he is lionized today as one of the great presidents, and in my view, rightly so, because he kept the country together during its darkest hour, um, it is easy to forget that when he was in office, Lincoln was a deeply controversial figure and a deeply divisive figure. Many, especially, actually, both South and North, saw him as a dictator. The only reason I'm mentioning that is because the bigger the personality, the more prominent the personality is, naturally, the bigger the consequence of that person's death is going to be. So I think partly because it was the first presidential assassination to succeed, and also because of that reason, Lincoln had already established himself as one of the big presidential names by that point, with the Emancipation Proclamation and everything that he had done. So it's not a case that Lincoln was going to be sort of vaulted into history because of the assassination. He already had his place in history. So I think that could be one reason. Also, he died instantly, um, and it was in public. A large part of the theatre saw what happened, Ford Theatre. So all those reasons, plus the way in which his death was handled, the sense that his body was taken throughout train, on the train throughout. I don't think it was throughout the whole country, but certainly for a good stretch. I think it was from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. Um, So all those reasons, I think, really brought it into the public mind, and this was the culmination of a very bloody civil war. So all those things, I think, brought it into mind. It's worth noting that Franklin Roosevelt died at the end of World War II of natural causes, but his death didn't quite have as big a public, it wasn't quite so big in the public mind, and I'm guessing that is because the World War II had really superseded everything. Even though Roosevelt died a natural death, I think that superseded everything, or um, surpassed everything, I should say. Okay, so the second presidential assassination, James Garfield, 1881, less than 20 years later, um, shot again in public, point blank range. To be fair, actually, all the presidents I'm mentioning were shot in public, and they were all shot. None of them were stabbed or poisoned or anything like that. Um, so he was killed by an anarchist who Charles Guteau, who basically was seen by some as mentally insane. He himself apparently rebuked his own defense counsel. Now, why is the Garfield assassination different from Lincoln's? Why did it not have the same public imagination? Why did it not get the same public sort of outcry? I think there's several reasons. Firstly, Garfield had only been in office for 6 months, so there wasn't a great deal that he could get done. I believe he had some civil service reforms passed, but that was it. And that's not I think for shorter term presidents, it wouldn't be fair to include them in presidential ratings because the man was killed. So it wouldn't be fair to hold him up against presidents who served for a longer period when he could have got more done. By all accounts, he seemed to be a likable man. He seemed to be popular enough within his party. He was never going to be one of the great presidents, but he was a steady figure. And certainly, when that happened, another interesting fact is he didn't die immediately. That's very important because it reminds me of when Reagan was shot. Now, Reagan survived that, of course, but by 1981, century later, 83, I should, no, 81, the medical procedures had hugely improved. Shockingly, even in the late 19th century, doctors at the time just didn't think of basic things like hygiene and passing on germs when they're treating wounds and so on. So, ironically, it's widely believed today the doctors probably has exacerbated his condition. So Charles Goodell pulled the trigger, but argued that doctors actually killed him, which is a complete tragedy. It didn't need to happen. And we may have known more about the Garfield presidency. He may have been one of the great presidents. He may have been a mediocre president. We'll never know. I think there would have been some security in place, but by this point, it was peacetime. The US was in a relatively peaceful state. There were some conflicts going on in the West with Native Americans, but they were low scale compared to the Civil War. So it was essentially peacetime, and I think the authorities had been complacent about that. So all those reasons, and the fact that he died, I think it was up to 4 months later. Um, I think that really makes that made that less prominent in the public mind. Then we go 20 years after that, 1901, President McKinley, who was assassinated at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, in the Hall of Music. An interesting side note about that, there was a British newspaper at the time, had the headline, President Shot Buffalo. Okay, the President, McKinley, the city, Buffalo. But Buffalo's not a very big place, so the British readers actually misinterpreted that. They said, who cares if the President shot at Buffalo? Because the British imagination of the US is like big, wild plains and so on. So that was misunderstood, and that's an interesting example of headlines, how journalists need to construct headlines in a certain way, and that was actually had some influence on the development of early journalism in that sense. So, President shot Buffalo should have been President shot in Buffalo. Anyway, again, the same thing happened. McKinley survived for a short time, and he actually had a slight upward upward development at that point. There was thoughts he might actually recover, but he died 16 days later. Again, the assassin, Leon Skolgitz, was an anarchist and he was put to death in the electric chair. Then, of course, JFK doesn't really need an introduction. It's still well within living memory, so anyone who's really in their 60s up, who lives in the Texas area, or anyone really, is going to remember that. And even those of us who weren't alive at the time are very familiar with the case because it's been so widely documented. There's been several films made about it. Now, why is that more prominent than both Garfield and McKinley? I think it's actually probably the most prominent, even slightly more than the Lincoln assassination. Firstly, it's the only one to have been filmed, so it's by far the most watched at the time. The others would have had hundreds of spectators. This one, possibly millions, because it was a live broadcast. And the brutality of that, seeing, even if it wasn't the president, seeing any man, seeing any person getting their head blown off in broad daylight would be a shocking thing to see. And when it's president of the United States, that just really adds to it. So I think that's one reason the Kennedy assassination stands out because it was so raw, so brutal. Also, the sheer number of conspiracy theories. And that also applies in the Lincoln case. There aren't really many conspiracy theories. In fact, I haven't come across any in either the Garfield or the McKinley case. There is one in the Garfield case, that is that when Chester Arthur succeeded him, Apparently, Guto had shouted, "This is for Arthur." So some had believed there was a conspiracy which Arthur was involved. I think that's highly unlikely. I think Guto was basically a madman and an attention seeker. So, with the Kennedy assassination, you did and still have many conspiracy theories. There was a rawness about the way in which it was done. There was also Kennedy's youth. And in terms of presidential rankings, Kennedy is not actually very often online. People are like, he was one of the greatest presidents ever. Actually, most scholars rank him around the middle ranks. He isn't seen as, in terms of legislative action, in terms of his actual record in office. Again, this might not be fair because he didn't manage to serve a full term, but Kennedy wouldn't be on the sort of level of Lincoln or Washington or Jefferson or Roosevelt. So Kennedy, I believe the presidential ranking has Kennedy around 13th. So one of the big side effects of the Kennedy assassination was to marbilize him as a heroic figure, as as a King Arthur type figure, and it was very much had the effect. But the circumstances around the case, again, like Lincoln, Kennedy had many detractors, especially in the South. So I think those are the main reasons why there's someone was just texting me. I'll get it afterwards. I think those are the main reasons why there's a difference between the Kennedy and Lincoln assassinations and the Garfield and McKinley assassinations. McKinley's ranking is quite high. Um, it's seen around the middle, I think, in the presidential rankings scale. Uh, excuse me. And Garfield usually isn't ranked. Simply, it's too short a time to give a fair assessment. Same with William Henry Harrison. Of course, there's been other attempts on presidents. Pretty much every president has had at least one attempt, especially that presidents. And this shouldn't be too surprising. These men have basically made decisions that impact millions of lives. They're the world leaders. They're extremely important. So inevitably, there's going to be some people that just don't like them. And I think both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are going to have very high security because I think there's extremists on both sides who would try something. In fact, there was already one attempted attack on Donald Trump by Britain. Um, I don't know what the penalty for attempting to kill a candidate is. I know that it's a life sentence for attempting to kill a president, but a candidate, I'm not sure. Anyway, that's interesting. Now, there's another thing I want to talk about. In fact, I'll make another video for it because this will be too long, and it's going to be coincidences between the Lincoln and Kennedy assassination and whether that means anything or not. Okay, so let me know your thoughts. Is there any reason why you feel that Kennedy and Lincoln get more coverage than Garfield and McKinley? Is it the reasons I have speculated on, or do you think there might be other reasons? Incidentally, when Garfield was assassinated, that prompted the invention of the X ray in order to find the bullet. Not that it helped him much at the time. And finally, looking at my own country, there has only been one prime ministerial assassination. That was of Spencer Perceval, a Tory. In 1812, he was shot at point blank range in the House of Commons lobby. The man who was executed for that had, in a similar way to Charles Guto, petitioned him for government jobs, which Percival didn't respond to. Percival was seen to be a kindly man, a family man, and unlike many aristocrats of the era, he wasn't interested in gambling and the good life. He was very much a religious man. So um, there isn't that much documentation about what the public reaction was, except that whilst Percival wasn't a particularly popular prime minister, the public didn't want to be seen as celebrating. So when the assassin was hanged at Tyburn or Newgate, it was at that point, um, the public didn't want to kind of show that they were sympathising with the assassin. But at the same time, I don't think there would have been national shock certainly, but I don't think there would have been the sort of shock that was seen in the US with Lincoln's assassination. Although we were at war at the time, this was the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. So anyway, interesting subject, presidential assassinations. Let me know your thoughts. And stay tuned for the coincidences between Lincoln and Kennedy.